Many of you might have wondered why this was in your bag, this new guidance, but let me tell you why. It's very exciting. It's the first time that there's ever been women's nutrition guidance in humanitarian settings all in one place. So previously, there's been a bit of guidance here, bit there, bit, all sorts of places. And one of the big recommendations we had a couple of years ago was to make one guidance for pregnant and lactating women or pregnant and breastfeeding women in humanitarian settings. So next slide, please. So I've got to be really quick because I haven't got long. So I'll just tell you very briefly the kind of process we went through. So obviously you can see that loads of women suffer from one or more forms of malnutrition. And as I've said, there were gaps in practical guidance. So with the support from USAID, the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs, and a GNC, which is the Global Nutrition Cluster, we set up a task force for women's nutrition. And the GNC task force had multiple members, civil society organizations, WHO, WFP, so there was very good representation from all stakeholders involved in humanitarian programming. There was a big evidence review conducted, and that provided the the sort of basis of what we could and couldn't recommend. And then it took every weekend of mine since January this year, so I'm delighted it's finally finished and out there. But we made sure that it was a very inclusive way to get guidance. So WFP were very involved in the balanced energy protein because recommendations, because they're the ones who implement that, more support governments. Next slide, please. So there's different parts to this guidance. Oh, and by the way, it's in French. I hope my Francophone colleagues got the French version in their bag. It's also in Spanish and Arabic. And apologies, Mozambique, it's not in Portuguese, but I'm going to now try and find some funding and get it translated into Portuguese as well. It's separated into several sections. The first one is around the situation analysis. Next slide, please. And the main points of a situation analysis is that we understand what are the priorities and needs of women in your context, in your humanitarian situation. And this is our big, major message. Please, if at all possible, include some questions on women in whatever assessment you do. We're not suggesting you do a separate survey or a separate rapid assessment or a separate analysis, because that's not going to happen. The reality is there's not going to be time and there's probably not going to be funding. But if we don't include any questions on women, then we end up in the same place as we are now, where we simply don't have the evidence on what works. Okay, so when we did the evidence review, we reviewed all of these documents, and there's basically very little to guide us to say categorically, do this, not that. There's some evidence, but not a huge amount. And if there's no evidence, if we don't know, if we can't advocate to say this is effective, then we won't get any funding for it. And if there's no funding for it, then there's no programming for it. And if there's no programming for it, then there's no evidence collection. And we end up back at the same place we are now. So our real ask for all practitioners and governments is to, if you're doing, say, a rapid assessment for under 5 children, just put a couple of questions in about women. Or even better, do a MUAC assessment of women while you're there in the house or in the health facility, measuring children, screening children for undernutrition. Do a mid-upper arm circumference measurement of the women. And then we'll know what the problems are. Okay, so next slide, please. So then we looked at, okay, once you know what your situation is, what interventions can we recommend? What should we be doing? Next slide. And this was the sort of response framework. So we've outlined the vision, the objectives. We've looked particularly at 3 systems: health, food, and social protection, because in humanitarian situations, that's often where nutrition can fit the best. And then on the right, you'll see that there's these 6 different areas of evidence-informed nutrition interventions. Next slide, please. So these are the 6. The first one is around nutrition screening. Then second one is macronutrient supplementation. Third one is micronutrient supplementation. Fourth is nutrition education and counseling. Fifth is nutrition responsive social protection. And 6th is women's empowerment and gender transformative programming. So I'm not going to go into all of those because there's no time. But for this audience, next slide, please. The third recommendations around micronutrient supplementation, okay? Now, bear in mind, WHO were on the GNC task force for this, so they have signed off on these recommendations. So we're really thrilled because we've got these 3 recommendations. The first one, give iron-containing supplements. That's not controversial at all. We all know we should be giving iron-containing supplements. The second one is that MMS is recommended for all pregnant and breastfeeding women and adolescent girls in humanitarian contexts. So it's the humanitarian context is the bit that allows us to make this very strong recommendation for MMS for everyone, okay? Now, in order to get WHO to agree, because as you know, the WHO recommendations are less broad than this, the third one is there. That was our compromise. Where MMS is not available, IFA should be given. That was our compromise to get MMS in as an overall recommendation. Okay, next slide, please. So after the interventions, there's then these response scenarios, because what we thought was like, there's so many different kinds of humanitarian situations now. You know, from a mass transit population traveling through Europe or Latin America to food crisis in Sudan, or conflict and food crisis, to a typhoon in the Philippines. There's so many different types of humanitarian contexts that you're going to need. We tried to come up with some scenarios to help you think, well, this is my situation, and therefore my response should be X. Next slide. So this first one is the table is a bit complicated, but it's not that it's actually quite simple. But what we looked at was what your existing nutritional vulnerability is, and we've got high, medium, and low. Okay, so this is like saying your high nutrition vulnerability context will be a country such as Ethiopia or maybe Nigeria, where areas of those countries you've got very high wasting and stunting levels at any time. And then a crisis comes, and that's the situation you're in, versus low, which could be Ukraine before a conflict, where there might be high levels of anemia and overweight and obesity, but there wasn't wasting and stunting. Or if we look at Lebanon and the Syria response. So depending on these, what's called IPC, which is the integrated phased classification, either of food security or acute malnutrition, we've gone with this high, medium, and low. And basically, the only difference is about whether you're screening by MUAC and providing balanced energy protein for all women or for targeted women in medium, or not at all in the low. That's really the main difference, and this household food assistance. Next slide. The other scenarios we were trying to give some examples of are these different types of humanitarian situations that you'll find yourself in. It might be a complex humanitarian situation. It might be protracted. It could be, you know, the Syria response, and it's gone on for the last 10 years. It might be transit, and this is more generally for high and medium income countries, but even within Africa, there's a lot of population movement going on now following various conflicts. So transit situation where you might only have 5 minutes or 10 minutes of an interaction. Your contact might be very, very short. And maybe what needed is a hot drink or somebody to charge their phone. It's not actually a nutrition response. So we're trying to look at these various different scenarios and what you should be looking for. And then, of course, there's now, unfortunately, more often than not, these public health crises. So there was COVID, for example, or Ebola. We've got our colleagues from Sierra Leone here who learned a huge amount through their Ebola response of what we should and shouldn't be doing for a nutrition response. Because, you know, for example, newborn babies were being separated from their mothers and all of this sort of thing. So there's things to learn through each one of these different crises. So we tried to give some scenario-based response planning. Next slide. And then I'm just going to skim through this. The last parts are monitoring and evaluation or learning and other considerations. Next slide. So there's a section on each of these: monitoring, preparedness, advocacy, disability inclusion, accountability to affected populations, and gender-based violence risk mitigation, because in a lot of conflict settings, gender-based violence shoots up and is a major issue. Next slide, please. An important thing, my last slide, I just want to say these research gaps. Because as I said at the beginning, right, we don't have enough evidence. And it's very frustrating when you go and do these evidence reviews and you think, well, okay, that study, they were actually included women in the study. But what did they measure? Infant outcomes. They didn't measure the women's outcomes. So this happens over and over again. So we really, really need some more data for women so that we can say categorically, this works, this doesn't, this is better than that. So focus on direct impacts like MUAC, BMI, anemia levels, and beyond infant outcomes. The next thing is looking at humanitarian evidence. We often assume that what's worked in a development context, we can just transpose that into a humanitarian context and that's going to work. Now that might work, but it might also not. And there might be specific contexts in humanitarian settings that those interventions are going to be more tricky. Okay, standardized research, and particularly looking at this, BEP at the moment, balanced energy protein, because when you look at studies around BEP, which is this catch-all term for all these various, whether it's, a dry food, corn, soya-based, or whether it's a LNS, lipid-based nutritional supplements, now what I'm finding is all these studies are not using the same product or the same amount, so they're not going to be comparable. So we really need to think about standardized research as well. The last important one is targeted demographic research. Now, again, we assume that pregnant and breastfeeding women, they're just a homogenous group. We just talk about pregnant and lactating women as though they have exactly the same needs. Now, again, they might have some needs that are the same, but there will be a lot of needs. It's quite different growing a baby to feeding a baby. So the mother's actual nutritional needs herself might be quite different. We also don't tend to separate in research pregnant adolescents from pregnant older women. And a 14-year-old girl on her first pregnancy is going to have very different needs than, say, a 28-year-old woman on her fourth pregnancy. So we need disaggregated information. And we also need to look at what happens if we layer interventions, because that's really what we need to do is layer interventions. It's not one intervention isn't going to make all the difference. We need to have, so when MMS is being given, are they linked up with the social assistance programs? Have they been screened for undernutrition? All of this linking. Next slide. And that's it. That's it. Thank you.